All right. We know that we do this really well and you don't want to stop. We know this, but we have to move on to other things. So first of all, there will be some slides. So for anybody who's got their back to the screen or will not be able to see the screen, we recommend movement now. There is a whole page. You're just going to do this. All right. They think they can see up here. Okay, so before we get started this morning, and Peter is going to launch our 9:30 session with our wonderful short takers, I think it would be a good time to pause for a minute. We do have some wonderful international guests, and yet we think that globally everybody knows that there's a pretty serious crack in American democracy, and that has to do with race. And we would like to take a moment of silence and recognize what happened in South Carolina. And also on your tables, there is a handout by Michael Wenger and Carolyn Abdullah from Everyday Democracy very graciously brought this and made copies for everybody. It's a yellow sheet, and if there are not enough, we have some more. Michael Wenger is a faculty member at GW and the author of My Black Family, My White Privilege, A White Man's Journey Through the Nation's Racial Minefield. And what he says is there are things that we can do individually and collectively, and you are welcome to use this, copy it, put it up on your websites, and do some of the things that he recommends we do individually. But in the meantime, I would like to take a moment and just recognize the tragedy in South Carolina. Okay, thank you very much. You know, it's totally not fair. I get this, and he gets peppy, and what was the other thing? Peppy, infectiously peppy. All right, thank you all for this time, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Thanks, Nancy. Good morning. So first, a quick announcement. Hahrie Boyd spoke last night about public work. Harry's a brilliant community organizer. One of the things community organizers do is they do one-on-ones with people in communities and find the stories and assets of those people and then connect them. And so Hahrie, in inimitable Hahrie style, found my colleague and friend Diane O'Donoghue, a Tufts professor, who has an amazing story of public work. And Hahrie wanted to highlight the story as a story of public work in the cultural domain as well, with a cultural aspect. So he's produced 30 copies or so of her story, which are out on the table, and so on the table as you exit. So if you would like to take one and read one, that would be great. And I endorse that too because I'm friends with Diane. I think people know the short take format. It's a little unusual, but we've been doing it for a while and we think it works. We have three speakers who each get 10 minutes and they just provoke you. There's no questions and answers. There's hyper minimal intros. Matt last night sort of changed that and began to make Frontiers into a roast, a civic roast, by insulting each of the speakers. But they're not talking to Matt, and for one thing, and also, you know, he in a peer-reviewed Oxford University Press book has been called infectiously peppy, and I'm not. So I'm just going to do the hyper minimal intros. A little bit more extensive intros are on the website, but this is actually a carefully contrived design where They provoke you from three perspectives. They made no effort to coordinate, and we didn't encourage them to coordinate their talks. But then the next session of about 20 minutes or so will be you thinking at tables about what you heard, resonances, connections among the talks. Usually there's serendipitous connections or tensions, which would be great. So I'm just going to be hyper minimal, and I'm going to say these are the three speakers. I think we'll start with Brenda Wright. Brenda is Vice President of Legal Strategies at Demos, which is a powerful and important, powerful in the best sense, influential think tank based in New York City. And she works on legal strategies involving voting rights, campaign finance, all kinds of issues having to do with our fundamental rights in the political system. Hahrie Haun is number two. Hahrie has been a professor at Wellesley College, moving shortly. Also an activist and a partner and a strong partner for a lot of activist organizations in America, working closely with them. So both a theorist and empirical social scientist, and also a partner for activists. She writes books in an incredible pace, and so the last two both came out, I think, within the last 12 months, which is, kind of intimidating. But one is a sole-authored book called How Organizations Develop Activists, and the other is a joint, so you only get half credit for the other one, a co-author, but it's called Groundbreakers. It's about the 2008 and 2012 Obama presidential campaign. I read both. They're super. And then the third speaker is Abhi Nemani, currently Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles, which is a fantastic venue for doing civic work, but also famous as the founder of Code for America, which has been changing the way governments work with citizens. So I am just, with that, going to turn it over to Brenda, and once you start talking, I'm going to time you. Oh.
Since I have a tendency to do that. On? Can you hear me? Okay, great. So it's great to be here with you all today. I'm going to be talking about a lot of the work that we've been really focusing on at Demos around overcoming structural barriers to political participation and voting. And the weight of history, as I think about this talk, is really on my mind this year. This year is a big anniversary year. In March, we had the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Pettus Bridge encounter. That's John Lewis, right before he got his head bashed in by state troopers in Alabama for marching for the right to vote. Last Sunday was the 50th anniversary of the murders of Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner, who sacrificed their lives in the cause of voter registration. And in August, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So what do we owe to this history? Now that's a big question. I can't answer that in full. I'm going to take just a tiny, tiny piece of it. Where do we stand on basic access to voter registration today? Unfortunately, the news is not all that great. We have about 51 million people in the US who are eligible to vote but are not registered. That's nearly 1 out of 4 eligible citizens. We have lots more people who may be on the rolls, but their addresses or their other information may be incorrect, so they may encounter difficulties in voting on election day. We have persistent biases and differences and gaps among different demographic groups in terms of their registration rates, and you can see persistently that's been true of income. It's also been true for much of our history, for race and ethnicity as well. And 20 or 30 years ago, it was received wisdom, at least in some quarters, that these differences in turnout and registration really might not matter that much because the views of those who didn't participate were believed to be very similar to the views of those who did participate, and therefore some folks felt it wasn't a matter to be overly concerned about. Unfortunately, the research that we're seeing today tells us that that has dramatically shifted. The views of registered and non-registered persons on issues of economic security, workplace policy issues, are in many cases very different. And if you looked, and I don't have a slide on this, but if you factored in the role of participation through money in politics as well, you'd see even starker differences between the views of even the general public and those of the very small donor class that makes up, that has such influence on our policies and politics. So what we end up with is a cycle of representational bias, with all of these aspects working in both directions. Diminished voter participation leads to diminished electoral representation, leads to disproportionate policy decisions and outcomes, and in turn, people who are not participating look at the system, they feel that it's not working for them, they don't have a voice, and they are even further discouraged. So one of the things we really need to do in the US is to shift the frame. The freedom to vote is a fundamental right, and freedom doesn't look like this. There's really no reason in the 21st century why we should stick with a system that places the burden on each individual to figure out how on earth do I get registered and keep myself registered? Where do I go to register? What documents do I need? What happens if I move? What if I've moved 3 times in the last 3 years? How do I get myself registered and keep myself registered? That burden is entirely on the individual, almost entirely on the individual in the US. In a government that's of, by, and for the people, we really should shift our frame so that getting people registered to vote and keeping them registered to vote becomes a responsibility of government and not a set of burdens and obstacles that each individual must overcome. Now, a lot of other countries in the world have figured this out, and you can see on the left is the 20-year average voter turnout in countries that place the most burden on individuals to figure out registration. And on the right, you see the 20-year turnout averages for countries that put the most burden on government to help people get registered to vote, to identify eligible people, and to get them and keep them on the rolls. Now, the US made a start at changing this 20 years ago when, and I'm putting aside the Voting Rights Act, which of course, you know, has been an incredibly important tool for bringing African Americans and other racial and ethnic minorities into the process. But in terms of just the basic burden of voter registration, we made an effort to shift the frame 20 years ago with the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. And the idea there was get government agencies who interact with the public on a daily basis, DMVs, public assistance offices, disability offices, to provide voter registration as part of their services. Another way we've tried to address this in the US is by enacting same-day registration, letting people show up on election day, and if they're not registered, you just register and vote right there on the same day. And the states that have that have a lot better turnout than those who don't. These reforms can have impact. My organization, I've been personally involved in kind of running around the country, helping to get the National Voter Registration Act really enforced in various states. We just had a settlement last week of a long-running case here in Massachusetts, and some of the numbers that you see from this are pretty eye-popping. Before we filed our lawsuit, there were 3,100 voter registration applications collected at these agencies in 4 years. That's 3,100 in total. And in 4 months after we had an interim settlement in this case, those agencies collected 39,000 voter registration applications. So you can have impact from these reforms, but I think we're ready to go further in this country. And the next step, I hope, will be automatic voter registration. Many of you may have heard about Oregon's adoption of automatic voter registration, became the first state in the country to do that. And the basic idea is, is that instead of just the agency-based model where you walk into the agency and they hand you a form, and if you want to vote, you fill it out and you give it back to them, and then they mail it to the election official, it gets automated. So the DMV in Oregon now is going to take the information that it has about people who interact with that agency. They're going to determine which of those individuals have presented enough evidence of citizenship and other eligibility that they are clearly eligible to vote, electronically transmit that information to the election authorities in the state, and then folks will be automatically registered with an opt-out option. They will get a postcard saying, if you really, really don't want to be registered to vote, you can check this box, send back the postcard, but otherwise, you're on the rolls, and we're going to make it our job to keep you there. So the challenge of making those systems fully inclusive, of course, is we've got to go beyond DMVs, and some of the things we need to think about are looking at our departments of corrections when people are leaving and returning to their communities, restoring their right to vote automatically. Looking at voter registration at naturalization ceremonies. Where on earth could it possibly make more sense to automatically register people than when they've just taken the oath of citizenship? And registration through schools at the age of 16 or 17, pre-registration, so that you'll be on the rolls when you turn 18. So just returning to our theme of history, you know, Faulkner said, and it's, I hope not too much of a cliche, but it's important, said history is not dead, it's not even over. And there are some bright spots, I think, for us to take hold of as we think about these issues in the US. In March, the first African-American president of the United States marched over the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis and many others, and that means something. The Andrew Goodman Foundation, established by David Goodman, Andrew's brother, is still hard at work helping young people participate in the political process, getting people registered to vote. And just yesterday, while you were all convening here, hundreds of advocates and activists gathered at a rally in Roanoke, Virginia, to demand that Congress fix and restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the work continues. My fondest hope is that when we reconvene here in the 2065 Frontiers of Democracy convening, we will no longer even be talking about the issue of voter registration because we will have solved it. Thank you.
Going to turn things right over to Hahrie, but help with the actually. No, it's fine. As well as I. Are you? There you go. Sorry. Oh. Oh.
Yeah, I know. We'll just trade. You know?
That's the new innovation. Everybody does somebody else. Is that it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's
There
right.
you
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. So I wanted to talk to you today about how organizations can build power by engaging people and sort of what it means to do that. But before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got to this work, like how I started doing it. I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas. My parents came to the United States in 1972. You know, they had the proverbial sort of $100 in their pockets when they landed in Chicago. And my mom worked as a domestic worker. My dad mowed people's lawns, and they really just tried to make it over the course of my childhood. And so a lot of what I saw over the course of my childhood was my parents trying to figure out how to be American. You know, they took us to Mount Rushmore. They did, you know, all the things that you're supposed to do to, you know, raise American kids. And in a lot of ways, they made it, you know. So by the time that I went off to college, my parents had moved from the neighborhood where we grew up into sort of a townhouse in one of the nicer neighborhoods in Houston, which is where we were living. You know, it was the same neighborhood where George Bush Sr. Had his country club down the street. You know, my parents lived in a townhouse in that neighborhood, but still, it was one of the tonier neighborhoods in that in the city. And so what I learned from watching my parents do that is that transformation is not only possible, but it's a way of life. You know, I think when you grow up as a kid of an immigrant, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room sort of had that kind of experience, you sort of had this sense that transforming yourself is just part of what you're doing constantly throughout the lives that you're living. And I think that that background was a lot of the reason why I do what I do today, which really is sort of try to study social movements and activism and what are the ways in which we get people engaged in these kind of movements. And the reason why I think that I'm interested particularly in movements as opposed to other ways of thinking about getting people involved is because the whole idea behind a social movement is that at its very core is this transformative process, right? The way you build power in a movement is by transforming what people think is possible. Right, before the civil rights movement that Brenda was talking to us about, you know, no one would have thought that some of the things that became possible by 1965 were possible. You know, that black people could come together and desegregate the buses, you know, things like that. And so movements are different from sort of companies or other ways of trying to get people to engage because you don't just sell people what they want, you change what people think what people think may be possible and transform their own sense of agency. And so the question then that a lot of what I try to look at in my research is, well, so how do you do that, right? How is it that organizations go about in creating that kind of transformation in politics? And so the book that Peter was talking about, How Organizations Develop Activists, part of what I try to do in that is try to think about how do you sort of engage people and do this transformative work in a way that actually builds power. And the reason why I was thinking about that was I felt like a few years ago before I started that project, a lot of what I was seeing when I was talking to organizations out there was sort of this funny paradox. And the paradox was this. On the one hand, people were like, oh my God, you know, we can get people engaged now, you know, more easily than we ever have before. The digital revolution has made it easier for more people to click, for more people to sort of do more stuff than we ever did. But on the other hand, you know, when I was talking to organizations that are on the front line, they were saying, yeah, we're getting more people to do stuff, but we're not building power. Right? We're not doing it in a way that actually is sort of advancing some sort of agenda for change that we want to try to advance. So how do we bring those two things together, right? And that was sort of the paradox that drove some of the work that I did. And so what I thought that I'd do, I'd talk to you about two things, one of which is actually not my work, but the work of Ziad Munson, who's a sociologist that wrote a book called The Making of Pro-Life Activists, and then how that links to sort of some of the work that I did for how organizations develop activists. So what Ziad did when he was thinking about the making of pro-life activists is he went out and he interviewed 80 or so people who are on the front lines of the pro-life movement, right? So these are the people that are standing outside the abortion clinics, harassing women who are going in to receive services. And so he was trying to figure out, well, you know, what were the pathways that got people to engage in this kind of activism? And what he found was that most people think that the kind of people who join the pro-life movement are pro-life, right? Like that's what we think. Well, who joins the pro-life movement? It's people who want to advance the pro-life agenda. But what he found was that instead of the people that he interviewed and of the people that he studied in his book, that half the people, almost half of the people who joined the pro-life movement were either pro-choice or they had no views on abortion when they joined the pro-life movement. Okay, so let me pause for a second. That should be shocking, right? Right? And the reason it should be shocking is because it goes against everything that we think, right? People join movements because they want to support that issue. Well, it turns out that's not true at all, right? A lot of the people who joined the pro-life movement, they joined the pro-life movement because they had just moved to a new town. They wanted to meet new people because they, you know, maybe it was a mom who had been working and just decided to stay home because she had kids and she wanted to sort of form a new social community. There's sort of all sorts of different kinds of reasons. You know, maybe they had a friend who invited them to a meeting. They didn't want to say no to their friends, so they came to the meeting. You know, where they came in to the movement because of reasons that were completely apolitical, but then what happened was that they became transformed, right? They became politicized, both in their views, but then also in their sense of agency, in their sense of what they thought they could do when they work with others because of their work in that movement. And so a lot of the question then that I was thinking about in doing the research for the book was trying to think about, well, how do organizations kind of create those transformative spaces? And so in the book, I make a distinction between mobilizing, and I call it organizing in the book. Some people call it distributed campaigning is another way of thinking about it. I know that yesterday one of the speakers spoke about the difference between thin and thick participation. There's sort of a lot of different terms that you can use. But what I find in the book is that organizations that focus just on doing that kind of mobilizing, the sort of thin participation that doesn't have any transformative aspect to it, the term that I use that was purely kind of transactional ways of engaging with people, their rates of activism are consistently lower than the groups that are doing the more transformative work, right? So not only are they not hitting their targets, they're also not transforming people in the same way. So what did they do differently, right? What was the difference between the organizations that were doing the mobilizing versus the organizing? Well, they differed in lots of different ways, in everything from what their strategy was for how they wanted to build power to how they communicated with their members, right? So in their theory of change, their strategy for power, for the mobilizers is really about hitting their numbers. We just want more people to do more stuff, right? What's the easiest thing we can ask people to do so we can get the most people as possible to do it, right? Whereas the whole idea behind organizers is, well, what we want to do is we want to build leaders, right, who themselves have been transformed so that they can engage others, right? The way that we get to scale is by transforming leaders who will be able to engage others themselves. How do we structure that work? Well, if you're doing mobilizing, you have a few people, usually paid staff, who are going to run all the activism, make all the asks, and do all the work, and they have this huge list of people to whom they reach out, right? The organizers, they distribute responsibility, right, because they have this whole network of sort of leaders that are working in different ways. What kind of ask do they want? Well, if you're a mobilizer and you want to try to hit your numbers, you want to ask people to work independently, because it turns out it's a lot easier and it's a lot quicker and it's a lot more efficient for people to do things by themselves than it is for them to have to work interdependently with others, right? Because if you're working with others, then it's a lot harder, but it turns out that that's where that transformative work begins to happen, is in the relationships that we create with other people around us. And finally, how do they communicate with others? Well, in mobilizing, it's a lot more about, it's that kind of marketing towards what people want versus building relationships through which people become transformed, right? And so the organizations that I found that were the most powerful were the ones that were able to blend that mobilizing and the organizing, right? You do the organizing work, that's where you build the power and the transformative space through which people become changed and build their agency, but then you do the mobilizing because that's how you get to scale. Right, so it's a combination of those two things that it allows you to go deep and to go broad at the same time. That's sort of the most powerful. And so, one of the questions that people ask a lot is like, well, if we go back to the pro-life movement, then how are they creating that transformation, right? How is it that they got 50% of people who joined the movement not even agreeing with the ideology of the movement to become transformed? Well, it turns out that, whoops, I just changed it, sorry. It turns out that it wasn't the clergy sort of speaking from the pulpit, right? It wasn't the sort of the leaders of organizations or churches. Instead, it was the person who ran the Bible study, right? It was the person that you met at your school PTO. It was the person who modeled for you what it meant to live a Christian life. And by the way, we're also pro-life, that people began to sort of change their views and their willingness to sort of get involved. And so it's in the everyday relationships that people begin to construct with each other where that transformation begins to go. So a lot of what I've been thinking about these days, and I know that you've had some other speakers who've also been thinking about this question probably in different ways, is how do we then, in our politics today, create spaces for transformation? Right? I think the frontier of civic tech in a lot of ways is, can we create the spaces for transformation online, right? How do we create them in sort of the organizations where even where we meet face to face, and those organizations are starting to change? And finally, I'll just leave you with the idea that if we're not creating those spaces for transformation, then we're leaving power on the table. And so if we want to build a power for change, if we want to capture all that power, it's a matter of harnessing that transformative capacity. Thank you.
I think I can handle the slides myself. I can probably figure that out. Of course, this is a PC, so I have no idea what I'm doing. Now you're seeing all the slides. I'm going to show you in a second. All right. So before we get started, first of all, you should just know that you should never trust a politician to just speak for 10 minutes. So Peter, watch the clock really closely. Also, then I just want to apologize that I took a red eye here. So if I don't make any sense or anything, just feel free to call me out on that it's because I just didn't sleep at all last night. And then the other thing I'll apologize for is you heard great talks just right now about racial equity, about how to elect a president, about power, and all I'm going to do right now is just tell you a couple of stories. So, again, I apologize if I didn't fit into the agenda well, but Matt asked me to come and tell you a little bit about what I've been thinking about around civic technology and how you can empower citizens through technology to actually make their communities better. So, if that makes sense, is that cool? So, I will start with, I think, the best example of how to change society through technology, which is Pearl. So this is my friend's good dog. This is my friend at Code for America. His name was Kevin Curry. He had a dog named Pearl who looks kind of ridiculous. But he lost his dog one day. It was during a staff meeting. He actually joined the staff meeting. He looked super uncomfortable. He was sweating. And we're like, Kevin, what's going on? He's like, guys, I just lost my dog. And we're like, okay, get off the conference call and then go figure out where your dog is. And so he spent, half the afternoon walking around, running around, trying to find it. His daughter joined him. But it turned out the way he found his dog was this. He actually met a UPS driver who was running around at the same time and said, hey, I've lost my dog. It looks that ridiculous. And can you see if you can find it? And what that UPS driver did was talk to the other UPS drivers all going around the city, and they found it in about 45 minutes. I will take credit for that, just personally. So that to me is interesting, right? Because it changes the way you think about solving problems, right? So instead of you personally going out there and having to go around the whole city, putting up signs and seeing who will respond, you actually can engage a network, right? You can engage a network that's already going around the city and doing work in a different fashion, right? But could happen to be civically engaged, right? Could happen to do something that's interesting, that helps you. So I thought that was a great example. And so in LA now, we're trying to take that to scale for other things than just finding Kevin's ridiculous looking dog. So we've done a similar thing around traffic and road closures. So have any of you guys been to LA before? I don't know if you know, but traffic is a bit of a problem there. I live downtown and work downtown, so I don't have to deal with that. But traffic's a big problem. And so what we thought about was how do we share our data around road closures to make sure that traffic's a little easier, right? So if you're driving around, you shouldn't have to just turn off the block because we're tearing up the street to fix it, right? So we thought, who do we share that with? Well, we thought, let's share that with Waze. If you guys are familiar with Waze, it's owned by Google, so it's Google Maps effectively. It's both in the same, right? So we shared that with them. But we did something based on that Kevin story where we asked them to give something back to us. I'll just go to this, which is we said that, we're going to give you this data to make your tool better, but can you do something for us as well? And so now, anytime that there's a hit and run, anytime that there's a kidnapping, we actually push that to the 1.3 million people in LA. So that's over 30% of the citizens of Los Angeles who use Waze. They get the notifications of kidnappings, of hit and runs, and they can then tell us if they're seeing that person who's been kidnapped or if they've seen that hit and run. So this is taking that example, that very, somewhat trivial example, but I think adorable, that trivial example of the dog that got lost and taking it to scale, right? And it's taking it to scale in a way that I think really matters. So we're trying to work on that kind of thing. Let me just go here, because I think that we too often, and we were just having this conversation here at this table, we too often think about building a civic app, right? A piece of technology that works, right? And Sandy and I were just talking about this, and I avoided her question because I didn't want to answer it because I was going to do it in my talk. We too often think about building that one app that solves all the problems. I think the much, much more interesting question is how do we get the apps that people are already using in their private lives, in their personal lives, and get those to be a bit more civic, right? And I wrote a blog post called Ubers as Ambulances that talks about that. And the funny thing is, after I wrote that, like, we've talked to a couple of companies and they're starting to do this, right? So Uber is now delivering flu shots during flu season. Airbnb during emergency situations is actually letting people freely use Airbnb locations. So you're actually seeing these kind of non-necessarily what I would call civic companies become a bit more civic, right? Become a bit more engaged. And at a high level, I guess the point here is that I think we have to start thinking about broadening what we consider public life and civic life, right? So because I don't usually get to talk to people who are academically oriented, so I'm really happy to be here today. I usually have to talk to geeks and stuff who understand code, and I just talk about that. But so I was a philosophy major in college, and I consider myself a student of Tocqueville. And if you look at Tocqueville's key insight, and Peter's smiling because this is all of his work, and I'm basically just parroting it. If you consider the main insight that Tocqueville had about American democracy, it was that instead of just private life and public life, we developed something that was called civic life, which was the mesh in between the two, right? And I think when we think about technology and how we're leveraging it, we have to do that. Right? We have to think about how we create that new kind of civic infrastructure for technology that connects the private and the public. And just the last thing I'll say, and again, be honest on time, is I think as we do that, we have to think about what I call the civic upsell, which is the idea that if you get someone engaged, and you all probably do this already in your work, but this is the way I think about it, is if you get someone engaged around technology and around civic life, you've got to keep working them, right? You can't just stop. And this is something that you were just talking about, right? You've got to keep engaging them. And the metaphor, the reason I think of this is like I just look at the consumer sector and what they do. So this is a picture of Amazon, again, Tocqueville. So you can see it's a recurring theme. Whenever you try to buy a book on Amazon, right, you've all seen this before, right? It says what other customers have bought. Right? It's the upsell, right? They're trying to get you to buy more things. And the same thing happens in the supermarket, right? A whole theory around nudge and behavioral economics has happened around this stuff. But, you know, the consumer sector has been really good at getting people to do more things that give them more money. Okay, yeah. So I think we should do the same thing in the public sector, too. And we're starting to do that. So this was the, so gov.uk is the main website for the UK federal government. It's wonderful. We can talk more about that later. This was their main thank you page beforehand for signing up for paying your taxes, right? Nothing there, just said thank you. They decided to then add a link that let people sign up to commit to organ donations. 350,000 more people signed up to do organ donations because they added one link to the website. Let me just say that again. I know I'm running out of time. 350,000 people signed up because they added one link to a website. So I think we have to really deeply consider how to leverage this idea of the upsell, particularly when we're getting companies like Uber to do things, like Google and Waze to do things. We have a huge opportunity there to engage people more deeply. And just in closing, I guess, there's a great book that was written called Small Pieces Loosely Joined, which describes the web. And Sandy, I'm going to go back to the conversation we were having before. I think as we go forward with civic technology, as we go forward about how we engage citizens with technology, we have to think about how we're connecting the dots between the different things that are happening. And that's what this, the great writer of this book talked about, is that the web wasn't built as just one platform that everyone could use, right? It was actually deliberately broken. It was deliberately decentralized because it wanted more innovation, right? They built it that way. And I think we have to do the same thing and think about the same thing as we go forward about engaging citizens through technology. So thank you, guys.
Thank you to all three. I thought those were terrific. They were also, two of them hit the 10-minute mark exactly at the second, which is, you were on the second. It was incredible. So you now have 15 minutes at the table. The assignment is sort of open, but it is to reflect on the talks and often to try to reflect on the way that they might intersect or relate to each other. And then someone will pop up in 15 minutes and give you instructions about a break and then concurrent sessions that follow.